Welcome, everybody. Just a friendly reminder to please turn off your cell phones before we commence our program. Also, a reminder that this program takes place on a Monday, once a month, every month here in the auditorium, as well as on Zoom. Another reminder, we have a workshop on Wednesday about rental increases. Presently, the workshop is full, but we are also doing it online, for which you don't need to register. And we have another of the same workshop. It's run by Logis Action from NDG next Friday. Also, Hershey Dwoskin is back next week on Tuesday after a long break for In the Headlines. So we invite you to that. And so without further ado, here is Dr. Joe Schwarcz with Science Demystified.
Thank you. We're going to start with the controversy that is burning up Montreal, which is, of course, about bagels. I mean, everything else seems to have vanished in light of this issue. All right. So what is the controversy? No, it's not the battle between St. Viator and Fairmont Bagel, which I think is a bogus thing because whenever we've done taste tests, no one can tell the difference between them. Maybe next time I will bring some from both and we'll do a trial on that. And which one do you like? Okay. All right. Well, that we can leave that debate. There is no debate about the New York versus Montreal bagel. New York bagel is a roll with a hole in it. Hmm? Yeah, well, of course they think. Of course they think, but they're wrong. Now, also, it's interesting when you look nutritionally at the two. So I got the same Viator bagel here, and Zabar's, which is, you know, the most famous food store in New York, their bagel. There's one dramatic difference. See what that is? The sodium content. Our bagel has essentially no salt in it. Theirs has 440 milligrams per bagel. That's a lot. The total amount of sodium that you should be taking in a day is about 1,500 milligrams. So one New York bagel is 1/4 of your daily allotment. That's quite a lot. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference in the nutritional content, but of course there is in the taste. In New York, sometimes not everywhere, they have some decent ones, but in most places, their bagels are steamed, not boiled the way that they should be. I mean, here we boil the dough in honey water, which gives it a sweetish taste and also gives it sort of a glaze. And of course, the key is to bake them in a wood-fired oven. And in most New York bagel places, they bake them in a regular oven. So it doesn't do. All right. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the real controversy, which is this thing that has appeared at St. Viator Bagel. And this is the bagel with no hole. And this is a frightening thing. This was all concocted by the Philadelphia Cream Cheese Company. Okay, why? Because of course they want more cheese to be able to be spread on the bagel, and if you take away the hole, then of course you have a greater surface area over which to spread the cheese, right? Because obviously if there's a hole there, you're not spreading the cheese over the hole. So St. Viator has bought into this, but they tell me only for 2 weeks. We'll see. So they've come up with this. And of course, it is exactly the same in terms of the dough. But instead of forming it into a ring, you form it into this cinnamon bun looking thing, right? And Of course, it tastes exactly the same. But yeah, I mean, let's face it, it's not a totally stupid idea because it is easier to spread whatever you're going to spread on the bagel without the hole. Anyway, Fairmont has not bought into this so far. We'll see what happens. But they have another claim to fame. I don't know how many of you know this story, but Gregory Chamadov is a Montreal boy, born here, a Jewish family. He moved to the US when he was very young. So he became an astronaut, and he's an American citizen now. That's why he's got the American flag. But he is cousin to the Fairmont bagel owner. And he decided that he was going to take Fairmont Bagel into space, which he did. And there it is, together with the Russian cosmonauts, sharing the Montreal Fairmont Bagel. So they have this claim to fame, and I don't think they're messing around with the holeless bagel. Anyway, it's interesting because I talked about this on the radio yesterday, and of course this arouses more interest than anything else. I always find this a curious thing. I'll talk about what I think are the most interesting things, and then you start talking about bagel, and that's when people really come out of the woodwork, and everyone has a comment on that. Anyway, as you may know, for 43 years, I've started the show with Tom Lehrer's classic musical piece about the elements, which is really, it's a wonderful song where he goes through the periodic table and sings about the elements, to the tune of I'm the very model of a modern major general. What show is that from? Pirates of Penzance, yeah, Gilbert and Sullivan, a song. Tom Lehrer was a professor of mathematics at MIT, but he was also a musician, and he wrote some very, very clever songs. If you get a hold of them, you'll really enjoy them. They're generally to the tune of, or they're words put to the tune of existing songs, mostly from Gilbert and Sullivan, but the lyrics are very clever. Anyway, why am I talking about Tom Lehrer? Because aside from writing that wonderful music that I've been using for 43 years, he was also the inventor of the Jell-O shot. The Jell-O shot is Jell-O that is made with alcohol. And that's not a small feat. That took some experimenting. And Tom did this in his younger days. But in order to really explain what this is all about, I have to tell you a little bit about collagen. Collagen is a protein. Proteins are long molecules made of amino acids, and collagen is one in which three chains of proteins are wound together in this helical fashion. Collagen is found in our connective tissues in the body. It's one of the main proteins of which our body and animals' body is made. But when you cook up collagen with either an acid or a base, you break it down into smaller fragments, and that's what we call gelatin. Now, gelatin has the ability to bind water. Once the chains of collagen have been separated, each of the individual little pieces of peptides, as we call them, can bind water. When you heat it up, the water evaporates, but it can soak up water again. But when you heat up the gelatin and evaporate off all the water, this is what is left behind. This is dried gelatin, which can be ground up into a powder. Now, this powder is very soluble in water, as you know, if you've ever made Jell-O or any gelatinous dessert. And it is very soluble, and it sets as a gel. But gelatin doesn't dissolve in alcohol. Now, Tom Lear had a problem. When he was young in his college days, he was invited to a party. But this was a party on an army base, and alcohol was not allowed to be taken in. This is why they came up with the Jello idea, because they thought they could sneak alcohol in the form of Jello. But the problem was that gelatin does not dissolve in alcohol. So they had to play around with this, try different recipes, and eventually discovered that just the right amount of orange Jello, water, and vodka would still gel. And they made it into the party without this being detected. And since that time, it has been a tradition among college students to make Jello with alcohol, especially whenever alcohol drinking is prohibited. Now, the idea of using gelatin is not new. I mean, this has been known since about the 10th century. And I suspect most of you have experienced this. If you make chicken soup, for example, you know that when it cools down, it becomes gelatinous, right? And that's, of course, because the collagen has been leached out of the bones and has been broken down into gelatin, and this is what solidifies the water. So anyway, that has been known for, a very long time. But it was Pearl Bixby Waite, an American, who really commercialized this. And he is regarded as being the inventor of Jello. And this happened in Leroy, New York, which is a very small town in New York State. And as you can see by the plaque here, in 1897, he introduced a gelatin dessert that his wife May named Jello. First 4 flavors were strawberry, raspberry, orange, and lemon. 1889, he began production of Jello in a factory building located near this site. September 9, 1899, sold the rights to Jello to the Genesee Pure Food Company of Leroy for $450. I think the company got a good deal there. If you ever want to visit there, that's where Leroy is. It's close to Rochester, New York, actually, in between Niagara Falls and Rochester. And why would you want to go there? Because believe it or not, this place, the birthplace of Jello, has the world's only Jello museum. And you wouldn't think that there could be entertainment enough there to make it worthwhile to go, but there is. One of the first things you'll see, not surprisingly, is the Jello cow, because of course that represents the bones of the cow from which gelatin is extracted. But inside, they have fascinating display of all sorts of things. Various kinds of gelatin desserts around the world. And you'll also see, amazingly, a display of all the different kinds of molds from which you can make Jello. Because, of course, when you make the Jello, it's in liquid form, and it only sets when it cools down. So you pour it into whatever mold there is. And of course, you'll see all the different flavors that they now have. But not all of them have been successful. Interestingly enough, they did at one time try to make coffee flavored Jello, and that never went over. It just disappeared. It has become a collector's item. And if anyone today still has an unopened box of coffee Jello, you stand to make a fair bit of money with that. But of course, that's because nobody has this. But all kinds of memorabilia, puppets that were used to promote Jello. and various spoons with sports personalities on them. And so it's really quite fascinating. There were also baseball cards that were in some special boxes of Jello, which also are worth quite a bit now because nobody ever thought in those days of keeping it. And you just see various kinds of Jello displays. And, you know, it's really, it's an amazing thing. One of the most interesting things is the head and neck of a giraffe, a real giraffe. Taxidermy, of course, allows one to do that. Now, why would Jello have a giraffe? For some clever advertising. When I'm eating Jello, I wish I were a giraffe because Jello feels so good when it slides down your throat, and giraffes have longer throats for it to slide down. So that was a big advertising feature. But who was the first person to be the spokesperson for Jello on the radio? No, we'll come to him, but before Bill Cosby. Very good. Yes. Jack Benny was the first spokesperson with his wife, who was Mary Livingstone. Yeah, very good. Yeah, he was the first person, and of course in those days it was all live radio, so he would go on and talk about Jello, and then he was of course replaced by Bill Cosby, which obviously has become a problem for the company. But in the museum, they still have his original the suit that he used in the very first advertisements of Jello. I think when he played a milkman or something. And so they don't obviously don't highlight Bill Cosby in the museum, but he's not forgotten. I mean, there's a stone there. Bill Cosby, thanks for 30 years of Jello giggles. Unfortunately, Bill did more than just make Jello giggle. So, you know, he's kind of rightfully being shoved aside. But anyway, it's you know, it's always interesting to look at some foods in terms of history and how this has evolved. All right, well, let's look at another. Yeah. Well, actually, that's an interesting question about whether Jello is kosher or not. It depends on which rabbi you ask, because one interpretation is that if a product has been processed to such an extent that you can't tell where it came from, then it is kosher. And there's so much processing between the animal bone and the final powder that it can't be traced back. That's the conservative view. I think Orthodox probably is different. However, you can still make kosher Jello because you can also make gelatin from seaweed, from agar that's found in seaweed. So that's it. Yes, that's what the kosher Jello is. Yeah, yeah. But again, I you know, generally the consensus is that gelatin powder it has been processed to such an extent that it can't be traced back, and therefore it is kosher. Anyway, I mean, you know, as you probably know, these are huge debates about, you know, what is kosher and what is not. Yeah. Yes, you cannot make Jello with pineapple or with fresh pineapple because it contains an enzyme that breaks down proteins. You can make it with cooked pineapple. Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to switch to another controversy, a recent one, which is very interesting. And it's the controversy about eating nightshade vegetables. First of all, there's a big controversy about why these are called nightshade in the first place. Obviously, what the name implies is that they don't like sun, that they grow in you know, in the shade. That just is not the case. Nobody really knows where they get their name. But what they have in common is that they contain compounds called alkaloids. Now, alkaloids are a family of compounds, but they do have a common feature in terms of molecular structure. And if you look at all these molecular structures, even though you have no idea what they really mean, you'll notice that every one has a nitrogen in it. And the nitrogen is always part of a ring. That is what alkaloids are. So they're naturally occurring compounds which have rings of carbon atoms and nitrogen atoms within that ring. Now, the reason that these are interesting is because they have profound physiological properties. Some of them, of course, you will be familiar with. I mean, there's morphine, which of course is found in the poppy. And morphine is an excellent painkiller and soporificant. That is, it can put you to sleep. You take too much of it, it will put you to sleep permanently. But and you may be familiar with some of the others too. Piperine, for example, that's a spice that you find in peppers. Obviously, caffeine, which is a typical alkaloid, as you can see the nitrogen atoms in the ring. That, of course, is why people drink coffee. So what alkaloids have in common is that they are found in nature. They have a similarity in molecular structure. They have these ring structures with nitrogen in it, and they have some sort of physiological activity, which can be beneficial or detrimental depending on how you are using these things. And obviously, morphine, caffeine are typical examples of that, where the dose matters. And we've spoken about that in the past extensively. There's the dose that makes the poison. So a small amount of morphine is beneficial as a medicine, but larger doses can be dangerous. So it goes with caffeine. Drinking a couple of cups of coffee a day, and the caffeine is not going to bother you. Drink 10 cups, and the coffee and the caffeine will bother you. And then, of course, there's nicotine. Nicotine is found in tobacco leaves. And this is the stuff that makes you addicted to tobacco. But one of the ones that gets a lot of discussion is solanine, which is found in potatoes once the potatoes have been sprouted, generally if they have not been properly stored. But if you go on Instagram these days or on TikTok, you will see all kinds of messaging about the danger of eating nightshade vegetables. Well, of course, the real danger is going on TikTok or Instagram in the first place, because what you find there mostly is garbage, and there's very few things that are believable, that you'll find there. But anyway, they go on and on about how we should not be eating nightshade vegetables because they are toxic. Well, again, this question of toxicity depends on how you're using it, depends on the dose. And one typical example of that would be atropine, which is an alkaloid. Again, you can see the nitrogen part of a ring structure. And this is a very interesting alkaloid. It is found in deadly nightshade or belladonna. These are pretty interesting looking plants, very often ornamental, but the berries contain a significant amount of atropine. Now, atropine is a very interesting compound. First of all, the reason that we have this name belladonna, which comes from the Italian, beautiful woman, because ancient Roman ladies would put a small amount of the juice of the berry into their eye to dilate their pupils, because dilated pupils made your eyes look bigger, and they thought that this was, a hallmark of beauty. Well, today, ophthalmologists sometimes still use atropine or compounds similar to atropine to dilate the pupil of the eye so that can examine it. So it has a medical use. But of course, in higher doses, it can be toxic. In fact, the name of this compound, atropine, derives from Atropos, the Greek goddess who was in charge of cutting the thread of life. There she is, cutting the thread of life, right? And is well known that in ancient Rome, atropine was used to poison people. The classic example recorded in history books is that of Livia, who was the wife of Augustus Caesar and poisoned him with atropine. We also know that the Romans would put juice of belladonna on their arrows to make them into poison arrows. Now, the reason that we're talking about it these days is because of the warnings that you will see on the internet, TikTok, Instagram, etc., about eating potatoes that contain solanine. Now, it's not a completely nonsensical idea because indeed, when the potato sprouts and starts to turn green, it does produce more solanine. Okay? Now, solanine is an alkaloid, very much like atropine. In high doses, it can be toxic. Now, interesting enough, the green color has nothing to do with it. The green color is just chlorophyll, because what that potato is trying to do when it's sprouting is photosynthesize. So it uses the chlorophyll, of course, to absorb carbon dioxide from the air. But the fact is that as it produces chlorophyll, it also produces solanine, although the two are independent. It's just that the green is a signal that you're also producing solanine. And there have been cases of such poisoning. Here's a classic So what if, you're just noticing that you have to let that belt loosen up a little bit? What does that really represent? Well, whenever we discuss obesity, the measure that we use is the BMI, the body mass index. And that is calculated pretty simply. All you have to do is know your weight in kilograms and your height in meters. You square the height, divide it into the weight, and you get a number. What do these numbers mean? Well, here's a rough view. If you are under 25 BMI, you have normal weight. If you're outside of the range of about 18 to 25, then you are either underweight, too skinny, or of course, overweight. Obesity begins at 30. That's sort of the cutoff that's been sort of accepted by the scientific community. And if you're over 35, well, you'd be in the category of the guy that we just looked at before, extremely obese. Now, before we get into more about this, the BMI, there's a little asterisk here, because it is possible to have a high BMI without being obese. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was in his heyday as a bodybuilder, he would have had a BMI of 31 because he would have weighed a lot relative to his height. But of course, it was mostly muscle. So it's not absolutely, for sure that if you have a high BMI that you're obese. Michael Jordan, during his playing days, would have had a BMI of 25 to 27. And certainly we would not say that he was obese, or obviously not even fat. But as a general rule, when you have a higher BMI, it is because you have extra body fat in places where you don't want to have it. Well, just when we looked before at the range of BMI, we saw that if you're too low, then you're underweight. If you're high, you're overweight, which would imply that in terms of the effect on health, what we're looking at is a U-shaped curve, right? We think that if you become more and more obese as your BMI increases, your risk of death increases, right? I mean, that's logical because of all the conditions that we saw that are linked to obesity. And also, if you are underweight, your risk increases. And therefore, there is a certain range of BMI that we should strive for, right? Which is healthy. Now, it turns out that things are not exactly the way that we would expect. As the years have passed, and we're looking at three different curves here, first from 76 to 78, and then later up to 2013, look at the bottom of the curve, which is what we think is the healthy range, right? The bottom of the curve is where you have the smallest risk of death. Look what has happened over the years. This curve has shifted to the right, so that what we are now seeing is that the healthiest BMI is actually outside of the range that we had previously defined. It said that 20 to 25 was the healthy range. Look where the bottom of that curve now is. It's around 27. How can this be? How is it that over the years, it turns out that if you put on some extra weight, you're actually healthier? So this is sort of a conundrum, but there are possible explanations for this. For example, people who are overweight are more likely to have medical problems for which they are receiving treatment. So they may be on blood pressure lowering drugs, they may be on statins to reduce cholesterol, which would mean that their risk of early death is reduced, even though they weigh more, but they're on medication. That's one possibility. Another one is that maybe that little bit of extra fat does have some benefit because the body can use fat as a source of energy. And there are some theories that suggest that your immune system works a little bit better when you're overweight. However, I think there's another explanation for this, and that is this one, that people with a lower BMI have lost weight, and they have lost weight because they have some disease process already. So they have fallen into that category, which we thought was the healthy, the 20 to 25. But they're in that category because they have actually lost weight due to some disease process that is going on. So this is why, it is so important to always analyze the data very carefully, because it may not mean exactly what it seems to mean in the first place, because when you just look at the curves that we looked at before, you say, oh yeah, well, look what's happening is that today we should be trying to put on a couple of extra pounds because you live longer. But I don't think that's the real answer. The real answer is that people who are losing weight because there's already some disease process going on now fall into that 20 to 25 category. So I don't think that there's an argument to be made for putting on a few extra pounds in order to try to stay healthy. I think that we have enough evidence to suggest that extra weight is not good. And unfortunately, we have in North America today really an epidemic of obesity, more so in the United States than here. And it is very, very apparent. I mean, all you have to do is when you watch the news at night, whenever you see reporters, out on the street somewhere where you have people standing around watching the interview, take a look at how many of them are obese. I mean, it's just a stunning number. Unfortunately, especially among the Black population, 70% is the statistic that is generally quoted for the Black American population to be obese. I mean, that's a really terrible statistic. And one of the main concerns that we have about this obesity is that it is a real risk factor for cancer. And that doesn't get talked about as much. But the connection here is very strong. Okay, let me give you some numbers here, because it's always interesting to look at cancer numbers, because again, there's a lot of misinformation about this. The last real numbers that we have is from 2022, because it takes time to collect these numbers. And there were estimated 20 million new cancer cases that we're talking here, globally, 9.7 million deaths. And basically, it means 1 in 5 people develop cancer in their lifetime. 1 in 9 men, 1 in 12 women die from the disease. Those are the frightening statistics. Lung cancer is the most commonly occurring cancer in the world. 2.5 million new cases every year. And then breast cancer, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, stomach cancer. So those are the ones that really are the most pain. But here is really quite a disturbing statistic. When we're looking at 2050, which isn't all that far away, right? We're looking at over 35 million new cancer cases. Now, again, you have to be careful about how you interpret this, because obviously the population is going to have increased very significantly by then. So the more people you have, obviously the more cases you have. And that's a 77% increase from the 20 million cases that we had in 2022. So what's happening here? First of all, there's just more people. So the more people who you have, obviously, you can have more cases. And not only do we have more people, but we have more older people because the average life expectancy is getting longer. And cancer is an age-related disease. So the more older people we have, the more cases you're going to see. But that doesn't explain it all. Because, of course, there are socioeconomic factors that come into play. Smoking, like alcohol consumption, and, of course, obesity. And with the expected increase in obesity, unfortunately, among the population, that accounts for a lot of that increase. So, we're looking at some scary numbers here. Now, there also are other factors involved. And one that is being looked at a great deal, because I think there's plenty of evidence for it, is air pollution. And we are breathing in a lot of stuff. You don't know that you're breathing in because, of course, it's all invisible. But we do inhale a lot of particulate matter, mostly tiny, tiny particles that are produced by diesel. And all of the trucks that are running out there are running on diesel. And there are a lot of trucks. I did a little experiment. Last time I drove to Toronto, I counted the number of trucks, the 18-wheelers, coming the opposite way. So not counting the ones going in my direction, just counting from Montreal to Toronto. Anyone want to take a guess? How many thousand? 3,000. 3,000. Now, I assume that there's just as many going the other way. So in that period of 5 hours, in that distance, there would have been 6,000 trucks spewing out diesel fumes, right? And those diesel fumes contain tiny little particles. And those particles get into your lungs. They get into the recesses, the alveoli in the lungs. And the body, of course, perceives these as for an intruder. And it mounts an attack against them. But in that attack, which we call inflammation, some healthy cells are converted into cancer cells. So polluted air, which may not be visibly polluted, right, can contribute. So that's a factor. Then, of course, there are the other nebulous factors, like, we hear about, artificial sweeteners causing cancer, paint fumes causing cancer. Those are very nebulous and very small in comparison to the known risk factors like tobacco and alcohol and polluted air. Now, sometimes people think that cancer is a disease of the 20th and 21st century, and that it's a consequence of modern life and food additives and processing and etc. This is not the case. As early as 3000 BC, the so-called Edwin Smith papyrus. Edwin Smith was the archaeologist who found this. This Egyptian papyrus already described cancer. And Hippocrates, of course, the most famous of the ancient physicians, the Greek physician, who actually coined the term cancer, And, that here we're again going back over 2,000 years. Now, Hippocrates is perhaps the most famous of all the ancient physicians. Why? Because he was really the first one to say that disease was not due to being cursed by the gods for some evil that you had done. He recognized disease as a process that goes on in the body. And he coined the term cancer because he was able to see some tumors, mostly on the outside of the body, because the Greeks didn't do autopsies. And the shape of the tumor to him looked like the shape of a crab. And the Greek word for crab was cancer. Well, that's where our name comes from. Did they treat cancer in those days? Yes. Hippocrates actually would cut out tumors that were visible or cauterize them, burn them. And sometimes, of course, that would work, but most of the time not. So he recognized that this was a disease that was mostly untreatable. But the first time that we had any connection to what actually causes cancer was relatively recently. It was in the 18th century when Sir Percival Pott, a British surgeon, linked scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps to the occupation. They were always covered in soot, and he said that this was what causes disease. And today we know that that is exactly true. There are many, many compounds that are produced in combustion processes that are carcinogenic. So those little particles that I talked about in diesel fuel contain all kinds of chemicals like benzopyrene and benzene and heterocyclic aromatic compounds, which are known cancer-causing agents. And of course, since that time, we have learned a lot about other things that cause cancer. The classic example is tobacco. And what is also quite interesting, that knowledge is relatively recent. It's only in the 1940s that suspicion was raised that smoking caused cancer. And it wasn't until another 20 years that there was enough documented evidence to declare tobacco to be a carcinogen. But so we know a lot now about what causes the disease, but we also have better methods of detection, better intervention. For example, we know that things like colonoscopy can detect cancer at a very early stage. And we've also learned a great deal about food. We know that a diet that is mostly plant-based is more conducive to protection against cancer than diets that contain a lot of highly processed foods. You know what those are? Those are the hot dogs, the frozen pizzas, the donuts, etc. Now, it isn't exactly clear what the culprit is here, whether it's the excess amount of salt, the excess amount of sugar, or there is something in the processing itself, or is it the emulsifiers that are used that will somehow interfere with our microbiome? So there is a lot of research in this area. And the suspicion is that some of that increase in cancer that I mentioned is due to people having more and more ultra-processed foods in their diet instead of eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. And what is really scary is this statistic. Because, we know that cancer is an age-related disease. So you expect to see more cases in older people. But what we are now seeing is a very significant increase in young people. And why this is a matter of a great deal of debate, and nobody really knows exactly why this is happening. But one theory is that it has to do with our microbiome. The microbiome refers to the colonies of bacteria that inhabit our gut. And there are many of these. I mean, there isn't even agreement on how many different species of bacteria there are in our digestive tract, but the estimates are anywhere between 500 to 1,000 different species. That's a lot of bacteria. And in fact, there are more bacterial cells in the human body than there are human cells. We are actually more bacteria than we are human. And it used to be thought that, you know, these bacteria were just sort of general bystanders and that they didn't affect us in any way. Well, that turns out not to be the case because there are many problems now that are being linked to an imbalance of these bacteria in our gut. For example, there's a type of E. coli. Now, E. coli is a whole family of bacteria, but there's one type of E. coli that now is known to produce a toxin called colibactin, which interferes with cell division, and it causes normal cells to become cancerous. So nobody really knows what is the optimal balance of bacteria in our gut, but we're getting more and more information that changes in the bacterial colonization of our gut can have a role in disease. And it is also possible that all of the ultra-processed foods are making a difference here because, of course, as this goes through our digestive tract, bacteria are exposed to this as well. And some bacteria, particularly disease-causing bacteria, may favor the remnants of all this processed stuff. And they grow and they squeeze out the healthy bacteria. But of course, once more, with this increase in gastric cancers in the under 50 years old, we also are seeing a significant increase in obesity in that age group. So that's probably part of the explanation. Now, another theory that has been floated is the overuse of antibiotics in children. Antibiotics, without a doubt, have an effect on the microbiome. Of course they do. Antibiotics kill bacteria. That's what they're supposed to do. But unfortunately, they don't only kill the disease-causing bacteria, they kill some of the beneficial bacteria that keep the disease-causing bacteria in check. So the overuse of antibiotics in children may now be catching up to us now. And we may be seeing this increase in cancer in the under 50-year-olds because these are the people who, when they were children, were exposed to a lot of antibiotics because their mothers were running to the doctor every time that the kid had a painful ear, and they would beg the doctor to prescribe antibiotics, and we may be paying for that now. Unfortunately, we're also seeing trends in breast cancer. This is also something that is very noteworthy. Now, if you look at this graph, you can see that up to about 2017, the incidence of breast cancer was pretty stable. And then we've seen a rise since that time. We're talking in young people. Why is this happening? Well, once more here, fingers are being pointed at the increased consumption of all these ultra-processed foods and at the expense of eating lots of fruits and vegetables. But another very likely explanation here for that increase in breast cancer is the increase in alcohol consumption by young women. And this is something that we are seeing. There's no question about that, what the trend is. And as you may know, the World Health Organization now says that no amount of alcohol is safe. So, when used to say, well, drink a glass of red wine with supper, it's probably going to do you good. Turns out that no, it may not be quite as harmful as they say, but it's not doing us any good. And Hippocrates, if we go back again to a time, at that time he was recommending that it's drinking a little red wine is a good thing, but he was right about disease not being a curse of the gods, but I think he probably was not right about this. But he was right about something else. He certainly was right about obesity. And it's interesting that even back then, 2,000 years ago, the ancient Greek doctors recognized that obesity and being sedentary was a risk factor. Now, one battle that of course goes on now all the time is the battle between nature and nurture. That is, are people genetically predisposed to be obese, and therefore they're losing the battle because it's actually being controlled by their body, or it is because of their upbringing. So I tell you this one last little story because it is a very interesting one with identical twins. Now, identical twins are excellent to do these kind of studies. Why? Because of course they are genetically identical, right? They have identical twins have 100% identical genes. So therefore, whatever you're seeing, if there's any difference between them, you know that it's not due to genetics, it's due to the environment. So this is why it's interesting, and especially when you compare them to fraternal twins, because fraternal twins don't have identical genetics, right? So it's very interesting. When you look at blood type and eye color, identical twins, of course, 100% the same, because we know that things like blood type and eye color are totally controlled by genetics. So these are the identical twins, and these are the fraternal twins. But when you look at IQ, for example, you see that identical twins, share a lot. They have very similar IQs. Fraternal twins, not. So there is some genetic component to IQ. Now, one of the most interesting twin studies that was done, interesting, although not highly impactful statistically, because it's a study of N equals 2, which was Mark and Scott Kelly, the identical twin astronauts. Mark was retired, but Scott went into space and spent, I think it was 6 months in the space station. Now, this was something that scientists really hit upon, because here was a way to compare what happens to twins, one of whom is in space and one is on the ground, and does it make any kind of a difference? So Scott in space took blood samples regularly. He documented, all his conditions, etc., and kept a record of everything that was going on. Now, one of the reasons that this study was interesting is because, as you know, there are plans, of course, to go to Mars. Now, to go to Mars is not the same as going to the moon. To go to the moon, it takes 3 days. To go to Mars would take a minimum of 9 months. And of course, 9 months to come back. And once you've journeyed for 9 months, you want to spend a little time there. So, I mean, we're looking at 2 years minimum, right? In a weightless environment, exposed to cosmic radiation, whatever. So what they wanted to see was whether or not there was a difference between Mark and Scott Kelly in terms of spending all that time in space. And the results were interesting. Most of Scott's markers, when he returned from space, went back to normal after a short time, but not everything. There were some differences. So there are concerns about spending months and months in space, and when you're looking at a journey, of 2 years in space, you have to consider all of these kind of things. Now, they weren't really able to study whether or not the diet made any kind of difference, because they couldn't eat the same kind of diet. When you are in space, of course, you're restricted to eating the food that is provided by NASA, and generally not very tasty. So they don't know whether or not the differences that they saw between the twins were due to diet or not. But we also have such studies of earthly twins. And this is really interesting. 22 pairs of twins were studied, where one in each pair was put on a vegan diet and the other one a normal, healthy diet. So still plenty of fruits and vegetables, but not vegan. And of course, the idea was to compare their health. And it turned out that after just 8 weeks, which is a very short time, there were significant differences in LDL, that is the so-called bad cholesterol, and also in insulin levels, and also in weight. The vegan dieters lost weight. The others more or less maintained their weight. So again, this is a very interesting study, because obviously these were identical twins, so that genetics was not a factor here. So what made the difference was the diet. And, we're seeing more and more studies like this, where people who have a diet that is more plant-oriented are better off. And finally, one last remark here is that when you look around the world at the so-called blue zones, and these are the areas where people seem to have impressive longevity, where you have a lot of centenarians, etc., and like Okinawa, Japan, and Ikaria, Greece, Sardinia, an area in Costa Rica, and Loma Linda, California, which is Seventh-day Adventist community. These are the places where people seem to live long, and they also have a mostly plant-based diet, although not exclusively. They do eat some meat, and they do eat a lot of fish. And one other interesting thing in the Okinawan diet is that they eat a lot of sweet potato, but a particular type of sweet potato, which is the purple sweet potato that you can mash and looks like that. Goes very well with chicken soup. And this is what it looks like. You buy it. Now, you don't find it in our normal stores here in IGA. Where I found it is in this store called TNT. Do you know that store on Lucerne? It used to be a Provigo, and now it's become this Asian store. It's really a remarkable store. It's this beautiful store, and you can go there and you'll see vegetables and fruits that you've never seen in your life, and all kinds of interesting stuff. And anyways, so they have these, and you boil them and mash them just like you would with sweet potato. Anyway, supposedly this is one of the factors in their long life. Who knows? But anyway, I can tell you that it tastes pretty good. So those are some of the interesting things that are, hot in the scientific world today. And, I mean, I'd like to tell you that charcoal broiled steak and French fries, coleslaw, dill pickle is the way to go. But unfortunately, that's not the case, So when we look at science, we go by the data, not by our wishes. Yeah. Cancer has a genetic component. Different cancers have genetic components to different degrees. Breast cancer certainly has a genetic component, and that's why, of course, people will check for the so-called BRCA gene, the BRCA gene. If you have that gene, which of course you've inherited, you have a very high risk. Lung cancer, much less genetic component. Lung cancer well, most lung cancer, of course, is caused by smoking. So yes, most cancers have some genetic component, but to different extents. Yeah. Charles? Really? Not prostate? Really? Hmm. Again, it's the same kind of answer as for the cancer. It has a genetic component, but it's not, certainly it's not 100% genetic, but there's a predisposition. Yeah. Yeah. It seems to be so. Yeah. I mean, switching to a healthy diet certainly doesn't hurt you, you know. So yeah, the question is whether you can undo what's already been done, and I suspect to some extent, yes. Yeah, yeah. Well, the average the human lifespan is different from life expectancy, right? Life expectancy is what someone born today can expect to live, which is, it's around in the Western world, the average is a little lower for men, higher for women, 80, it's around that. But the human lifespan is 122. Why? Because we know that it is possible. We have a record of one person, Jean Calment in France, who has lived to 122. So therefore, this is possible. So therefore, what we're looking at is to close the gap between the life expectancy and the lifespan. So I think, the living to 150, as, some people talk about, that's not likely. But I think we can close that gap somewhat. Yeah. Sorry? Absolutely, being more physically active, which, of course, is tied into virtually every disease. If we could just bottle that, but you can't. Yeah. Well, one of the things that you will notice in those areas, the blue zones around the world, is that they're very active people. It's not they don't have gyms. It's not like that, but they're all in their backyards growing their vegetables. They're walking all over the place. They don't sit in front of the TV all the time. So yeah, activity without a doubt is tremendously important. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yes, it is. Yeah, it is for sure. I mean, I play some during the show, some other stuff, but not at the beginning. At the beginning, it's always that one. Yeah. 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 I don't think rubbing alcohol, that would not have enough contact time. I would think that daily rinsing of the mouth with alcohol is probably not good. Yeah. No, that's rubbing alcohol. That's not. That wouldn't be a concern. Yeah. 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 Well, the reason that our ancestors who were much more active than we are still died early because they mostly died from infectious diseases, which can now control. You know. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there's a price to pay for convenience. That that you know. Yeah. When? Right. Right. I mean, yeah, the hunter and gatherer diet was probably better, but we also have to be realistic. I mean, we're not going to turn into hunters right. I mean, we have to do our hunting and gathering in the supermarket, right? Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you can't make smarter choices. I mean, there's a lot of crap in the supermarket, but you can get good stuff there too. Yes, well, your genetics you can't change. You can't select your parents. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What is Ozempic? You've been watching the commercials, right? Well, Ozempic is a great drug for diabetics. It's for type 2 diabetes. It controls blood sugar extremely, extremely well. And when it was introduced, a side effect was noted. The side effect was that they lost weight. Now, obviously, that was something that the manufacturer loved because it meant that you could also market Ozempic as a weight loss drug. And it works. You can lose a very significant percentage of your body weight. Uh, there are side effects, of course, mostly gastrointestinal, like nausea, uh, some concern about pancreas problems, but mostly it is a very good drug when it's properly used. No question that for type 2 diabetics, it works very well. Now, for weight loss, it works very well, but you have to use it properly in properly selected patients. This is not for the Hollywood starlet who wants to lose 5 pounds. This is for the person who needs to lose 50, 60 pounds. And it can work. But the real caveat here is that, well, first of all, it's injection, once a week injection, which is bearable. But you have to do this for the rest of your life. Because if you go off Ozempic, the weight comes right back. And given the fact that you have to do it for the rest of your life, we don't know the long-term consequences, right? Because the fact is that I'm often asked this question about long-term effects of a COVID vaccine, for example. The simple answer to this is that you don't know long-term effects until a long term has passed, right? So we'll see in a few years with Ozempic. But so far, I would say that when it's properly used, it's a very effective drug, certainly for type 2 diabetes and for some weight control, for massive weight loss when that's necessary. And obviously, it has been an absolute windfall for the Danish pharmaceutical company that manufactures it. Unfortunately, it's too late to buy stock now. It's already, but vast fortunes were made by people who had enough foresight to buy stock in that company. I mean, many people have become millionaires because of Ozempic. if they had the foresight to buy the stock at the right time. But who knew? I mean, I remember when Apple stock was down to $1. Remember that? Wasn't that long ago, maybe 30 years ago. It was down to $1. So now you say to yourself, why didn't I buy that? But because it looked like it was going to disappear. I mean, it had gone from, I think, $50 down to $1. It looked like Apple was going to disappear. But obviously, people who invested at $1 bought 1,000 stocks for $1 each. Now we're, multi-millionaires. But can't predict. All right, we'll see you next month.